Skull and Bones is a secret society set up at Yale University in 1832. With only 15 initiates each year, it is a recruitment ground for the very few who enter politics, finance, and education at the highest levels in America. But, in the Skull and Bones own documents, summarized in this report by Yale students who broke into the Skull and Bones Temple in 1876, it says that it is a chapter of a German university. Skull and Bones co-founder William Russell went to Germany before his final year at Yale, and came back with a leading member of a German secret society, who founded a chapter of that same society, Skull and Bones, at Yale, in 1832. Also, on the list of the first ever intake of Skull and Bones members, the 11th name is missing, which Sutton says could be the German who came back to Yale with Russell. To quote Sutton, Skull and Bones is a branch of a foreign secret society. Taking into account Illuminati cells had been emanating from Germany, and spreading out to Europe and other parts of the world, well before this time, it's possible that the inner core of the Skull and Bones was also Illuminati. After all, if it looks like a rat and smells like a rat. Yale University was named after one of its primary benefactors, Elihu Yale, who worked for the East India Company for 20 years, and became the head of the Fort St. George trading house in Madras, India. He amassed a huge fortune through the opium trade. This is important because, in Barrell's History of Jacobinism, he claims the East India Company had a secret dual purpose. 1. The trading houses were a front to set up Illuminati cells in Asia, from which the Illuminati could infiltrate those countries and take them over by demoralizing the people with opium addiction. 2. A huge fortune could be amassed by the opium trade. Many Skull and Bone members have ties to the Far East. It could be that this fraternity was set up as a recruitment ground for American leaders, who would continue to oversee the opium trade, and later the heroin and organ harvesting trades, child trafficking, as well as Illuminati infiltration of governments. There are other links between the Skull and Bones and the Illuminati, as mentioned by Sutton. The aims, such as world domination, the anti-Christian agenda, and state control, and methods to achieve them, in particular the use of controlled opposition, are identical. Also, the in-house ceremonies and initiation rites are similar, and they are allied with the same Wall Street bankers and corporations. Sutton says it is best not to see Skull and Bones as a separate identity from other secret societies, foundations, think tanks, spy agencies, and so on. Instead, it should be viewed as a secret society within those groups. According to Sutton, the Skull and Bones link to China can be traced back to the 1911 Chinese Revolution. The Qing dynasty were puppets of Wall Street. Not only did they subdue the population with opium addiction, but also, in 1911, they nationalized 4 Wall Street railway projects. This meant, to cover their debt they owed to the banks, they sold the railways back to the American investors who built them, depriving locals of profits from the railways. U.S. Secretary of War and Yale bondsman Henry Stimson financed the Qing dynasty against the uprising, but Sun Yat-sen led the rebels to victory, and proclaimed the Republic of China, freeing the Chinese from the Anglo-American Illuminati establishment. But the new Republic of China was hampered by internal bickering and civil war among the warlords for it ever to become stable, and after the Second World War, the Chinese Communists, led by Mao Zedong, were able to seize power in 1949. In Sutton's book, U.S. General George Marshall had stopped supplying ammunition to the Chinese Republicans in 1946, so they could be eventually overrun. But Sutton says this order would have come from the top, above the military, and who was General Marshall's supervisor during the war, and the Secretary of War just before this order was issued? Our old friend, Yale Skull and Bones member, Henry Stimson. This parallels the U.S. withdrawing support for the White Russians during the Russian Revolution, so they could be overrun by the Bolsheviks. Sutton claims the same financial establishment that not only financed, but planned and created the Russian Revolution, also supported Mao's rise to power, so China could be a new arm of the Illuminati world revolution. He lists many of these banks and companies in his book, and even gives their exact location on Wall Street. They are all tied to the Skull and Bones. Taking into account many of these companies are connected by partnerships, intermarriage, and names have changed over the years, those highlighted in red are a few that supported Mao, either before or after he took power. Chinese Premier Xi Jinping's family suffered heavily during Mao's Cultural Revolution, from 1966 to 1976. The 1911 Chinese Republic is the new Republic of China that he is trying to revitalize today, a nation free from the claws of the globalists, free from the satanic militant wing of the Chinese Communist Party, which is financed by George Soros and the Rockefellers, so human rights and freedom can prevail in China again. In his 2021 speech commemorating the 1911 revolution, Xi Jinping said his country had been humiliated, the people subjected to great pain, and the Chinese civilization plunged into darkness by Western powers, but the 1911 revolution had liberated the people, and brought democracy to China. But, as already mentioned, this was not to last. Yale Divinity School was established at Yale University in 1822. Many blogs contain this statement. In 1903, Yale Divinity School established a number of schools and hospitals throughout China, that were collectively known as Yale in China. It has since been shown that Yale in China was an intelligence network, whose purpose was to destroy the Republican movement of Sun Yat-sen, on behalf of the Anglo-American establishment. The Anglo-American establishment hated Sun, because he wanted to develop China. On the other hand, they loved the Chinese communists because they intended to keep China backward, and were committed to the production of drugs. One of Yale in China's most important students was Mao Zedong. Yale in China was run by OSS operative Reuben Holden, a Skull and Bones member, and longtime associate and advisor to Yale University. During World War II, Yale in China was a primary instrument used by the U.S. establishment and its Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner to the CIA, to install the Maoists into power. So Yale in China was a non-profit organization, or NGO, which are used today as fronts for child trafficking, and also for laundering money to subversive groups, to help them bring down governments opposed to the New World Order. With Mao installed as a New World Order puppet, hell could now be unleashed upon the Far East on an unprecedented scale.
During the Cultural Revolution that religion as a whole would be attacked and that atheism would be enforced. The four main religions under Mao's regime. Christianity. From 1966 to 1976, religious life in China was effectively banned. The Three Self Church, China's largest Protestant organization and one of the largest in the world at the time, was taken out as well. Christians would be executed by communists and thus went underground to practice their religion. Bibles were destroyed, churches were looted, and Christians would be subject to humiliation. Islam, like most other religions, were part of the four olds that the Red Guard was told to smash during the Cultural Revolution. The problem with this, however, is that China has a region where 50% of the population is Muslim. The Xinjiang Autonomous Zone presented a great challenge to China due to its numerous separatist movements by the Uyghur people. Furthermore, an uprising by the Muslim Hui people in Shadian stood up to the Cultural Revolution. It was here that China used MiG planes to kill 1,600 Hui Muslims. To make matters worse for the Chinese government, many of these Muslim movements were being supported by the Soviet Union during the Sino-Soviet split. Buddhism. Since Buddhism was, and still is, China's biggest religion, they were allowed a restricted amount of state-sanctioned practice. This, however, was taken away during the Cultural Revolution. From 1966 to 1976, temples were destroyed, religious texts were burned, and other violent eradication measures were taken in order to stop public expression of religion. Furthermore, Chinese attacks on the Tibetan region increased. All monks and nuns were forced to marry or sent to labor camps. Religious texts and books were considered as poisonous and were burned or thrown into rivers. Taoism, or Taoism, can count as both a philosophical and religious belief. It has played a prevalent role in Chinese life throughout history, much like Confucianism. Under Mao, Taoism was harshly suppressed due to it being viewed as a deviant superstition and harmful to Chinese society at the time. Similar to Buddhism, temples and art were destroyed, land was confiscated, and priests and nuns were forced back into everyday life. Similarities to Stalin. From 1932 to 1937, Joseph Stalin declared the 5-year plans of atheism. All religious expression within the Soviet Union were to be eliminated, and the very concept of God was to be dismantled. Much like Mao, Stalin would resort to persecution of the religious mass via arresting or shooting religious officials, burning down religious buildings, etc. Newly captured territory in World War II were to be subject to this as well, but were relatively lax in comparison to the homeland. Overall, the Cultural Revolution was successful in suppressing any visible practice of religion within the country, but it was unable to cause any permanent changes to Chinese society as religious practice would recover some years later.
In August 1966, a Beijing resident returned home to Beijing from his university. At the time, the high points of the CCP's Cultural Revolution were in full swing. One weekend, he and his brother went out to buy breakfast, but what he witnessed that day stayed with him since then. On their way, they passed a Catholic church near the city's Suanwu Gate.
When I passed by the church, I saw that the doorway was crowded with people. When I got to the door, I saw 20 to 30 nuns standing at the door, and the church staff in their uniforms were bowing their heads, and a group of Red Guards surrounded them, shouting, "Down with God."
When he walked to another of the church's doors, Ma saw a middle-aged man lying on the ground. A group of Red Guards, or Communist Party guards, wearing yellow military uniforms, surrounded him. The guards forced him to shout, "Down with God," and threatened to kill him if he refused.
This man was shaking. He said, "I do not dare to shout. I do not dare to shout. I have been a believer since my childhood. I do not dare to shout." And then the Red Guards rushed to him like a pack of wolves, using belts with copper head to hit his head. His head was soon gushing blood. He fell to the ground, twitched for a while, then stopped making sounds.
This was just the start of the CCP's 10-year Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong started the movement to bolster his personality cult and get rid of his political opponents. In August 1966, Mao wrote a letter of enthusiastic support to the Red Guards. At that time, they were mainly middle school students in Beijing who vowed to eliminate anyone not towing the Maoist line. The vice principal of a middle school in Beijing was tortured and beaten by her students and the Red Guards for several hours on campus before passing away. They used what became a favorite torture method, whipping people with leather belts fitted with heavy metal buckles. That month was later dubbed Red August for the series of massacres that followed. And that's not the worst of it. As unbelievable as it sounds, China even saw cases of human cannibalism during the Cultural Revolution. That's according to the CCP's own records, smuggled to the U.S. Chinese state-run media has also published articles confirming the reports. A 1993 New York Times report called Guangxi Situation the most extensive episodes of cannibalism in the world in the last century or more. It explains that these cases were different because those who took part were not motivated by hunger or psychopathic illness. Instead, the actions took place in public, were organized by local Communist Party officials, and people took part in them together to prove their revolutionary ardor to the CCP. Citing Chinese government documents, the newspaper reported that at some high schools, students killed their principals in the school courtyard and then cooked and ate the bodies to celebrate a triumph over counter-revolutionaries. Song Yongyi is a Chinese historian and lecturer at the California State University in Los Angeles. He tells a story about how a local branch of China's communist government essentially forced people to eat others.
There was a low-ranking militia named Ling Youyuan. Although this man was also a murderer, he did not eat people at first. The minister of the country's military department, Huang Yituan, told him, "You go down and kill someone, and after the killing, bring me back the liver. We want to burn it and eat it." Ling asked himself, "How can I do that?" So the first time he resisted. When he came back, the minister warned him that, "Next time, if you fail to carry out this order again, we will eat you." This militia then actively began killing people, cutting out their livers and taking their gallbladders. The evil ideology of communism has two sides. It has its violent and cruel side, and at the same time, it's very good at deception. When communism first appeared in mainland China, it also used beautiful slogans and very tempting social prospects to attract people to join, to attract people to identify with it. But only when it came to power would it reveal its true face. Those are the tragedies we saw in mainland China, in the Soviet Union, in Cambodia. We have seen too many of these tragedies over and over.